Everyone at that table had a category for Natalie Strauss. The secretary, the +1 nobody expected, the woman who wasn't supposed to last one course at a Lombardo family dinner, according to Clemente's cousin, who'd said so with the easy confidence of a man who'd clearly never watched her survive 14 months of Clemente himself. Clemente hadn't corrected him. He'd assumed, quietly, the same thing. Then the doors opened, and the woman who spent her days fixing his terrible seating charts and correcting his even worse assumptions walked into his world wearing red. And by the time dessert arrived, she'd charmed his aunt, diffused a rivalry he hadn't noticed brewing, and caught a security leak his entire team had missed. Clemente Lombardo built his life on knowing exactly what everyone was worth before they opened their mouths. Natalie Strauss was about to become the first miscalculation he couldn't file away and forget. Tell me, has anyone ever underestimated you and you quietly, devastatingly proved them wrong? Comment, prove them wrong, because that's exactly what's about to happen to Clemente. Also tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I'll like to see how far this story travels. Clemente thought he'd invited his secretary to dinner as a joke. He was about to discover the joke was entirely on him. The seating chart had been Natalie's problem for 3 days, which meant it had technically been Clemente's problem for 3 days and 15 minutes, since he'd handed it to her without reading it and gone back to whatever he considered more important than 40 armed men sharing appetizers. She found him in his office at 4 in the afternoon, feet up on the corner of his desk in a way that would have looked casual on anyone else, and looked, on Clemente Lombardo, like a man deciding whether a piece of furniture had earned the privilege of holding his weight. Matteo occupied the chair across from him, tie loosened, going through something on his phone with the particular boredom of a man who considered most business beneath him and had never once been asked to prove that opinion wrong. "You've seated Senator Valenti next to Rocco Ferraro," Natalie said, setting the revised chart on the desk between his shoes. "I know who I seated him next to. Rocco's former fiancée married Valenti 11 years ago. I looked it up because I couldn't imagine you'd do that on purpose, and now I have to imagine something considerably worse." Clemente glanced at the chart without moving his feet. "They're adults. They're adults with access to weapons and, historically, grudges that outlast most marriages." Natalie folded her arms. "I'm simply pointing out that men with 20-year vendettas and loaded firearms are traditionally wonderful dinner company. I read that somewhere. Possibly a eulogy." Matteo laughed before he could stop himself, the sound sharp and delighted, and Clemente shot him a look that did nothing to actually silence him. "She's not wrong," Matteo said. "You put Rocco next to the man who married his fiancée, and you're surprised I'm the one who finds this funny." "I'm not surprised," Clemente said. "I'm disappointed in the standard you've set for yourself." Natalie had worked for Clemente Lombardo for 14 months, long enough to have stopped flinching at the particular flatness of his voice when he was being amusing, which happened rarely enough that most people missed it entirely, and assumed, incorrectly, that the man had been born without a sense of humor, rather than one buried under several layers of very expensive tailoring. "I'll move Rocco to table 3, she said, already reaching for her pen. "Away from anyone he's divorced, related to, or shot at. Which, going through the rest of this list, narrows his options considerably." "You've become remarkably comfortable insulting my family," Clemente observed. "I've become remarkably comfortable insulting your seating arrangements. Your family is lovely. Your logistics are a war crime." Matteo grinned outright now, delighted in the way of a man who rarely got to watch anyone speak to his cousin like this, and had apparently decided, months ago, that Natalie's survival was the most entertaining ongoing development in the Lombardo household. "She's better at this than the last 4 assistants combined," Matteo said. "You should marry her for the seating charts alone." "I'll pass," Natalie said, not looking up from her notes. "I've seen what happens to people who get too close to this family. Half of them end up on a chart like this one, seated across from someone who wants them dead." "You'd survive," Matteo said. You wouldn't last one course at an actual Lombardo dinner, though. The formal ones. The real ones. Natalie considered that with more amusement than the comment deserved. I've survived 14 months of managing his calendar, his temper, and the fact that he schedules 3-hour meetings and expects them to end in 40 minutes. Dinner sounds, comparatively, like a paid vacation. Clemente looked at her then. Actually looked. The way he sometimes did when something had shifted slightly off the axis he expected it to sit on. Then come, he said. The words landed in the room and simply sat there for a moment, the way a sentence does when the person who said it hasn't fully decided whether he meant it as a challenge, an invitation, or a test he assumed she'd fail before it began. Natalie looked up from the chart. Is that an invitation or a threat? Whichever gets you there at 8. She studied him for a long moment, long enough that Matteo, sensing something in the air he wasn't quite equipped to name, went suspiciously quiet in his chair. Natalie had spent 14 months absorbing exactly how Clemente Lombardo operated. He didn't make offers he expected to be accepted. He made them the way other men made bets, confident in the outcome before the terms were even settled, and she understood, with total clarity, that he expected her to laugh this off the same way she laughed off most things he said, without meaning them. She thought of Matteo's easy assumption that she wouldn't last one course. She thought of 14 months spent behind a desk, fixing the mistakes of men who never once wondered what she might be capable of outside the 4 walls they'd assigned her to. What time? She asked. Something flickered across Clemente's face. Brief, almost imperceptible, gone before she could name it. 8, he said again, steadier this time. I'll need overtime. She left before either of them could recover, the revised seating chart tucked under her arm, and didn't allow herself to consider, until she was safely in the elevator, exactly what she'd just agreed to. The red dress had been hanging in her closet for 11 months, purchased on a bad day for reasons she'd never fully examined, waiting for an occasion she kept promising herself she'd eventually find. Tonight, apparently, was the occasion. The shapewear underneath it, she discovered within 4 minutes, had other plans for the evening entirely. Natalie stood in front of her mirror, wrestling herself into a garment that felt less like undergarment and more like a hostage negotiation with her own ribcage, and reflected that whoever had invented modern shapewear had clearly examined the female respiratory system and concluded it was, at best, optional. She checked her reflection once, twice, adjusted a strap, and reminded herself, firmly, that Clemente Lombardo signed her paycheck and could not, under any interpretation of employment law, have her executed for leaving before dessert. She called for the car anyway. If I'm not back in 3 hours, she told the driver, sliding into the back seat, tell my mother I died professionally. The Lombardo estate rose ahead of her, gold light spilling from every window, and Natalie took one last steadying breath before the doors opened. Clemente had been half listening to Matteo explain why seating Senator Valenti anywhere within shouting distance of Rocco Ferraro qualified as either diplomacy or attempted murder, an argument Matteo had apparently decided was worth revisiting 3 separate times over the course of the evening, when the doors at the far end of the room opened. He glanced over without much interest, expecting another late arrival, one of the cousins who treated punctuality as a personal insult, and lost enough of Matteo's next sentence that his cousin eventually stopped talking altogether and simply followed his gaze. Natalie stood in the doorway and read. It wasn't that Clemente had never noticed she was beautiful. He employed her, not suffered from cataracts. He'd cataloged the fact the same way he cataloged most things about her, efficiently, without particular ceremony, filed alongside her preference for cinnamon in her coffee and her habit of tapping her pen against her thumb when a meeting ran long enough to genuinely irritate her. What unsettled him now was the sudden, total absence of everything he'd unconsciously built around that fact. No desk between them. No efficient knot of hair at the back of her neck. No expression suggesting she'd already located 3 errors in whatever he was about to say. Here, In a room full of people who had spent their lives learning how to look like they belonged somewhere, there was simply nothing to file her behind. Clemente, who had built most of his adult life around knowing exactly where everything belonged, discovered he had absolutely nowhere to put Natalie Strauss. Clemente. Mateo's voice, distant, amused. Clemente. He finally looked over. Mateo was grinning in the particular way that meant he intended to enjoy whatever came next, considerably more than Clemente would. "Oh," Mateo said, "this is going to be entertaining." Clemente ignored him and crossed the room, arriving at Natalie's side with the composed, unhurried authority he brought to every room he entered, undermined slightly by the fact that he'd forgotten, somewhere between the doors and this exact spot, what he'd actually intended to say. "You look different," he managed, which was, he recognized immediately, an observation of stunning inadequacy. "I usually wear pants," Natalie said. He offered his arm, because etiquette required it, and told himself, firmly, that the warmth of her hand, settling against his forearm, registered as nothing more than an ordinary social formality. Natalie, for her part, was privately reconsidering several of her life choices, chief among them the belief that shapewear engineered for structural integrity would allow for anything so ambitious as walking, and decided that whatever internal migration her organs had undertaken over the last hour was a problem for future Natalie to solve. The rest of the evening, however, belonged entirely to her. Clemente watched, with the particular fascination of a man discovering an entire wing of a house he'd lived in for years without knowing it existed, as Natalie moved through his family's world with an ease that made his own guarded formality look almost clumsy by comparison. She remembered his Aunt Rosalia's recent hip surgery and asked about it with genuine warmth rather than obligation. She recalled that Cousin Enzo's daughter had graduated from law school in the spring and congratulated him before he'd finished introducing himself. She diffused, with a single well-placed joke about seating charts, the exact tension Clemente had spent 3 days pretending didn't exist between two men who hadn't spoken in over a decade. She knew these people. Not the way Clemente knew them, through years of blood obligation and inherited history, but through 14 months of managing his calendar, his correspondence, the quiet administrative machinery that kept an entire family's business running, and in doing so, she had absorbed more about the private lives of everyone at that table than most of them realized anyone outside the family had ever bothered to learn. He found himself, more than once, simply watching her, instead of participating in his own dinner. It was during the second course that a woman named Bianca Adornetto, elegant, sharp-eyed, married to one of Clemente's more distant business associates, leaned across the table with a smile calibrated precisely enough to pass for warmth. "That's a bold dress," Bianca said. "So fitted. Brave, really, for tonight." The table went quiet, in the specific way rooms went quiet when someone had said something that could, depending entirely on delivery, be either a compliment or a small, elegant knife. Natalie smiled, unbothered, and didn't miss a beat. "I spent 8 hours in an office today," she said pleasantly. At this point, wearing anything without a waistband feels courageous. Bianca's smile faltered, uncertain whether she'd been complimented in return or quietly dismantled, and settled, eventually, for silence. Clemente watched the exchange with something he didn't immediately recognize as pride, filed it away for later examination, and said nothing. Waiting, out of some instinct he hadn't consciously decided to follow, to see whether Natalie needed him to intervene. She didn't. He found that he minded considerably less than he expected to, and rather more than made sense. It was near the end of dinner, as dessert plates were being cleared, that Adrian Viscari, a businessman Clemente had cultivated carefully over the past year, useful, ambitious, always slightly too eager to prove his own importance, leaned toward Clemente with an easy smile. "Congratulations on Belandi," Viscari said. "Excellent acquisition. You'll do very well with that portfolio." Clemente's expression didn't change. It couldn't afford to. The Belandi acquisition had not been announced. It existed at present in exactly 6 sets of hands, all of them under Clemente's direct authority, secured by confidentiality agreements Natalie herself had drafted less than 2 weeks earlier. Beside him, he felt Natalie go very still. She leaned toward him, her voice dropping beneath the surrounding conversation. All the warmth from moments earlier, suddenly replaced by something sharper. "I need to tell you something." Clemente kept his eyes on Vascari, who was already turning to speak with someone else, entirely unaware of the silence he'd just detonated at the other end of the table. "What?" Clemente asked. Quiet, controlled. Nobody outside 6 people should know about Belandi. Natalie's gaze flicked briefly toward Vascari and back. "I drafted the paperwork myself. I know exactly who's seen it." Clemente's attention shifted, slow and deliberate, toward the man laughing easily 2 seats away, utterly convinced he'd said nothing more than a pleasant compliment. Neither Clemente nor Natalie was smiling now. The dinner continued around them with the same easy warmth it had held for the past 2 hours. Glasses refilled, laughter drifting from the far end of the table, entirely oblivious to the fact that something had just gone quietly, catastrophically wrong at the head of it. "Don't look at him," Clemente said, low enough that only Natalie could hear. "You telling me not to look at someone makes looking at him my primary biological urge." Natalie. "Fine." She kept her eyes on her wine glass instead, turning it slowly by the stem, the picture of a woman entirely absorbed in her own thoughts about nothing in particular. "But you should know that suppressing curiosity has never once worked on me, and I don't see why tonight would be the exception." Clemente didn't answer immediately. He was watching Vascari with the specific, unhurried attention he brought to problems that required patience rather than force. Cataloging the man's easy laugh, his relaxed posture, the complete absence of guilt or awareness in the way he reached for his glass. "He doesn't know he said anything wrong," Natalie said quietly. "That's the part that should worry you. If he'd stumbled into it by accident, he'd be nervous. He's not nervous. Meaning, he genuinely believes the acquisition has been announced. Meaning someone told him it had been. Or showed him something that made him believe it had been." Natalie set her glass down without drinking from it, some of the earlier warmth in her expression replaced by the focused stillness Clemente had occasionally glimpsed in the office, usually right before she found an error in a contract that 3 lawyers had already approved. "I prepared that paperwork myself, Clemente. I know exactly who received copies. 6 people. You, Matteo, your legal counsel, the 2 board members required to authorize the transaction, and me. Someone leaked it. Or someone accessed it who was never supposed to see it in the first place." She glanced toward Vascari again, careful this time, quick enough not to draw attention. "There's a difference, and it matters which one we're dealing with." Clemente absorbed that with the same stillness he brought to every genuine crisis, the composed, frightening focus that Natalie had witnessed exactly twice before in 14 months. Once during a hostile takeover attempt that had nearly cost the company its shipping licenses, and once, memorably, when a junior associate had mistakenly copied a rival executive on an internal memo. Both times, the temperature in the room had dropped, without Clemente raising his voice even slightly. "I need to know how he knows," Clemente said. "Tonight, if possible. Discreetly. You want me to interrogate a dinner guest in the middle of dessert. I want you to do what you did to Bianca Adornetto 10 minutes ago. Ask a question that sounds like nothing while learning everything you need." Natalie considered that, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite pleasure, but close to it. The particular satisfaction of being trusted with something that actually mattered, rather than merely tolerated. "That's going to cost you overtime," she said. "Add it to my account." She turned toward Vascari with an ease that made the transition look effortless, complimenting him on a recent business venture Clemente knew she'd only just learned about from half-overheard conversation earlier in the evening, drawing him gently into a discussion about expansion plans, timelines, the kind of small talk that felt like nothing and yielded, within 4 careful minutes, exactly what they needed. He mentioned reading about it, Natalie said afterward, leaning close to Clemente again, her voice tight now, with the specific frustration of someone who'd found an answer she didn't like. A summary document. He said his associate showed him something last week, an internal briefing that referenced the Belandi terms directly. He assumed it had gone public because it looked official. Letterhead, formatting, the works. There's no public document. I know, which means someone created one. Internally, using details only 6 people were supposed to have. Natalie's jaw tightened. That's not a leak, Clemente. That's fabrication. Someone built a fake briefing convincing enough to pass as legitimate, and it's circulating outside this family. Clemente's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very cold. Who else has Viscari discussed business with recently? I don't know yet, but I know 6 people had access to the real documents, and I know I'm not the one who leaked them, and unless you suspect yourself, that leaves 4 people we need to look at very carefully. The observation landed with more weight than either of them had expected it to carry. Clemente studied her for a long moment, not with suspicion, she realized, but with something closer to recalculation, the specific expression of a man discovering that the woman across from him understood the architecture of his business considerably better than most of the executives currently drawing salaries from it. You know this administrative landscape better than my own security team, he said. I built half of it. I know who prints what, who forwards which emails without reading them first, who borrows the small conference room and forgets to lock the door behind them. Natalie's voice had steadied now, professional again, despite the dress, despite the wine, despite everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. If someone inside this company fabricated that document, I can probably find out how faster than anyone you'd hire from outside to look into it. Clemente was quiet for a moment, weighing something she couldn't quite read. I'll need you to stay after everyone else leaves, he said finally. We should talk properly, without an audience. Natalie glanced down at the dress, the shoes she'd been quietly regretting for the past hour, and the general architecture of an evening that had begun as a joke and was rapidly becoming something considerably more complicated. I knew accepting free food from you would have consequences, she said. Something flickered at the corner of Clemente's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Matteo, watching from 3 seats away with an expression of undisguised delight, made a mental note to bring it up later, repeatedly, for as long as he possibly could. The last of the guests filtered out just after midnight, a slow exodus of expensive cars and murmured goodnights, until the great hall stood empty except for staff clearing glasses, and Clemente, standing near the windows with his hands in his pockets, waiting for Natalie to finish gathering her things from the small study where they'd retreated an hour earlier. I need you to look at everything, he said when she reappeared. Correspondence, document access, calendar permissions, anything that touches the legitimate side of the business. Quietly. I don't want whoever did this to know we're looking. I can start tomorrow. Natalie adjusted the strap of her dress, wincing slightly as she did. A small, involuntary movement, Clemente noted, without fully understanding why he was noting it. I'll need access to the executive server logs, which means I'll need you to authorize it personally, which means you'll need to trust that I'm not the one who fabricated a confidential briefing document about my own employer. I already trust that. You said that very quickly. I decided it very quickly. Clemente studied her for a moment, something careful in his expression. You could have exposed that acquisition information a dozen times over the past 2 weeks if you'd wanted to profit from it. You've had access longer than anyone else at that table tonight. If you were selling secrets, Natalie, you'd have made considerably more than a secretary's salary by now. That's oddly reassuring, coming from you. I intended it as a compliment. Your compliments require translation, but something in her posture had eased, the last of the evening's tension finally loosening from her shoulders now that the immediate crisis had a shape, a plan, a next step. I'll need overtime for this. Real overtime. Not the kind where you assume gratitude covers it. Name your terms. I'll email them tomorrow. In writing. Organized crime doesn't exempt you from employment law, Mr. Lombardo. I own the company. That wasn't the reassuring counter-argument you thought it was. He almost smiled again. She was becoming disturbingly good at producing that particular near expression from him, twice in one evening now, which she suspected was some kind of personal record, and gestured toward the door. My driver will take you home. I have a car service. It's after midnight, and you've been standing in those shoes for 6 hours. Take the driver. Natalie considered arguing on principle, decided her feet had suffered enough for one evening, without adding a philosophical debate about independence to the tally, and allowed herself to be walked to the car. Clemente climbed in after her, which she hadn't expected, settling into the seat across from her with the loose, unhurried posture of a man who'd spent the last several hours holding himself carefully upright and had finally, quietly, stopped. You're coming too? We still need to discuss the timeline for the audit. Of course we do. The car pulled away from the estate, city lights sliding past the windows in slow, golden streaks, and for the first time all evening, Natalie allowed herself to actually relax. Shoulders dropping, spine curving slightly against the leather seat, the accumulated exhaustion of the night finally settling into her bones, now that there was no one left to perform composure for. You did well tonight, Clemente said into the quiet. With my family, with Vescari, with Bianca. I have 14 months of practice reading people who don't think I'm paying attention. It's more than practice. Natalie glanced over, surprised by the plainness of it, the absence of anything guarded in his voice for once. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. The bar was apparently low. Extremely. She smiled despite herself, tired and warm, and finally, blessedly, free of the need to hold her spine at a socially acceptable angle. She stretched slightly, felt the shapewear beneath her dress shift in a way that suggested it had finally, mercifully, begun conceding ground, and let out a small, involuntary sigh of relief. I've been fantasizing about taking my bra off for the last 2 hours. I want that on the record. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1.5 seconds too long. Natalie replayed what she'd just said, in real time, with the specific horror of watching her own mouth betray her in front of the one person she absolutely could not afford to say that to. Clemente kept his eyes forward, jaw set with what looked like enormous effort. Have you? He said. I would like to formally resign. Denied. You cannot deny a resignation. That is not how resignations function. You can resign tomorrow, during business hours, through the appropriate channels. His voice remained perfectly even, but something underneath it had shifted, some careful control working slightly harder than it should have needed to. Tonight, you remain employed. Tonight I would like the car to swallow me whole. The car doesn't have that capability. Then I'd like you to pretend the last 30 seconds didn't happen. I find I'm having difficulty with that request. Natalie closed her eyes, mortification warring with something else entirely, something warmer, more dangerous, curling low in her chest at the specific, careful stillness in his voice, the sense that whatever composure he usually wore like armor had, for just a moment, developed a genuine crack. Neither of them spoke again until the car pulled up outside her building. Clemente walked her to the door, which she hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with, standing on the sidewalk in a dress that had started the evening as a small act of defiance and ended it as something considerably more complicated. Thank you, she said, for tonight, for trusting me with this. Thank you for coming. A pause. Careful. I didn't expect you to. I know. She let herself inside, and through the frosted glass of the door, watched his silhouette linger a moment longer than necessary before finally turning back toward the car. He told himself, driving away, that he was simply waiting to see the light come on in her window, a reasonable precaution given the evening's revelations. The light came on. He watched it a moment longer than any reasonable precaution required, and then, finally, told the driver to go. Monday arrived with the particular cruelty of ordinary mornings following extraordinary nights, and Natalie dressed for the office in the same navy blazer and sensible trousers she'd worn every day for 14 months, hoping, with the specific optimism of someone who knew better, that returning to familiar clothes might also return everything else to its familiar shape. It didn't. Clemente was already in his office when she arrived, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way she'd seen 100 times before and found, this particular morning, considerably more distracting than she had any right to. He looked up when she knocked, and something crossed his face too quickly to name before he schooled it back into the composed neutrality she'd built her entire professional understanding of him around. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He returned his attention to the documents in front of him, with more focus than the moment strictly required. "The server logs are ready. IT set up restricted access under your credentials, effective this morning. Efficient." "I try." She settled into the chair across from his desk, opening her laptop, and caught him glancing at her again. Brief, almost involuntary. Gone the instant she looked up. "Is there something on my face?" she asked. "No. You're staring at it rather intently for nothing to be there. I'm reviewing the timeline for the audit. You're looking at my face while reviewing a timeline." "No." "Multitasking," Clemente said, with a straight face that might have worked on anyone who hadn't spent 14 months learning every variation of it, and returned to his documents with the air of a man who considered the conversation closed. Natalie let it go, mostly because pursuing it further would have required acknowledging things about the ride home that neither of them had mentioned since, and set to work instead on the access logs, grateful for the familiar comfort of a problem she actually knew how to solve. Matteo found her in the small conference room an hour later, coffee in hand, wearing the particular grin of a man who had witnessed something delicious and had been waiting all weekend for the opportunity to discuss it. "You broke him," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "I did no such thing. He hasn't stopped mentioning you since Saturday. Yesterday, he asked me, apropos of absolutely nothing, whether I thought red was a common color for evening wear." Matteo took a slow sip of his coffee, clearly enjoying himself. "I've known that man since we were children. He has never once asked me an opinion about color. He's investigating a security breach. Colors are probably a metaphor for something in his very serious mafia brain." "Natalie, I'm working, Matteo." He left, eventually, still grinning, and Natalie returned her attention to the logs with the specific determination of someone who very much did not want to examine what he'd just said. By early afternoon, she'd built a working map of everyone who'd touched the Belandi files in the 2 weeks before the dinner. Access timestamps, document downloads, print requests, calendar overlaps, and had begun, methodically, ruling out the impossible before hunting for the improbable. It was during this process that Daniel Mercer appeared in her doorway, a corporate lawyer from the legitimate side of the business, tall and easy-smiling, the kind of colleague who treated Natalie like an equal rather than an obstacle standing between him and Clemente's calendar. "I heard you're running point on the audit," Daniel said. "Need an extra set of eyes? I'm free for lunch. I might take you up on that. I've got about 6 names I need background on. Anytime." His smile lingered a beat longer than strictly professional. "There's a decent place 2 blocks over. My treat. I'll let you know." He left with an easy wave, and Natalie returned to her screen, unaware that Clemente, passing the doorway at that exact moment, on his way to a meeting he did not actually need to attend, had witnessed the entire exchange with an expression that would have alarmed anyone paying closer attention. By the time she checked her calendar that afternoon, she found Daniel Mercer scheduled for 3 separate meetings during his usual lunch hour, 12, 12:30, and 1. Each one flagged urgent, each one requiring his presence in a different building entirely. Natalie stared at the calendar for a long moment before marching directly into Clemente's office. Are you weaponizing my scheduling system? Clemente didn't look up from his desk. No. You scheduled Daniel Mercer for 12, 12:30, and 1. He had availability. He no longer does. Because you filled it. With meetings that require him to be in 3 different places, none of which are the restaurant 2 blocks from here. That's an interesting theory. It's not a theory, it's a calendar, and I built the calendar system, Clemente. I know exactly what a legitimate scheduling conflict looks like, and this isn't one. She crossed her arms, watching him with the particular focus she usually reserved for contracts that didn't add up. Why does it matter to you whether Daniel takes me to lunch? It doesn't. Then cancel the meetings. They're necessary. They are not necessary. They are petty, and I would like you to admit that at least one of those things is true. Clemente finally looked up, and for a long moment said nothing at all, some careful calculation working behind his eyes that Natalie couldn't quite read. Not defensiveness, exactly, but something closer to genuine confusion. A man encountering an emotion he had no established category for and refusing, on principle, to examine it too closely. The meetings stand, he said finally. Natalie opened her mouth to argue further, then closed it, some new and uncomfortable suspicion beginning to form in the back of her mind. One she wasn't remotely ready to say out loud, mostly because saying it out loud would require admitting she'd started hoping it was true. She turned to leave, and had almost reached the door when something on her laptop screen, still open on the conference table where she'd left it, caught her eye. An access log entry she'd glanced past twice already without registering its significance. She stopped. Clemente. Something in her voice made him look up properly this time. The Belandi files, she said slowly, scrolling back through the log. They weren't just accessed by someone who shouldn't have seen them. What do you mean? Natalie turned the laptop toward him, her finger resting on a single line of text. They were accessed using your credentials, your login, your authorization. She looked up at him, the earlier irritation about lunch meetings entirely forgotten. At 8:40 on Saturday night, Clemente's expression went very still. I was at dinner, he said, with you, the entire evening. The realization settled between them slowly, the way the worst kinds of realizations always did, not with drama, but with the quiet, sickening logic of a puzzle piece finally clicking into a shape neither of them wanted to see. You were with me, Natalie said again, half to herself, tracing the timestamp with her finger as though staring at it harder might change what it said. The entire dinner. I remember exactly what time Vescari mentioned Belandi, because I checked my watch right after, and it was well past 8:40. Which means I didn't access those files. Clemente's voice had gone very flat, the particular stillness that Natalie now understood. After tonight meant something considerably more dangerous than anger. Someone used my credentials while I was sitting at that table. That's not a leak anymore. Natalie sat down slowly, the shape of the problem reorganizing itself in her mind into something far worse than she'd initially assumed. A leak means someone saw something they shouldn't have and passed it along. This means someone has the ability to impersonate you inside your own systems. That's not carelessness, Clemente. That's a compromised authorization, and it means whoever did this could access anything you can access, whenever they want, and make it look like you did it. Or make it look like I authorized something I never actually agreed to. Natalie went still, the second half of the implication landing a beat behind the first. The acquisition itself, Belandi. You think someone's not just leaking information about it. I think someone might be steering me toward it. Clemente's jaw worked once, the only outward sign of how carefully he was holding himself together. I approved the initial terms 3 weeks ago, based on financials my own team verified. If those financials were altered, or if someone's been managing which information reached me and which didn't, then you might be walking into an acquisition designed to hurt you, Natalie finished, and you'd have no way of knowing until it was already signed. They sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet except for the distant hum of the building settling into evening, most of the floor already empty, the two of them alone, with a problem considerably larger than either had expected it to become. "I need everything," Clemente said finally. "Every document related to Belandi. Every communication. I want to know exactly what information reached me, when, and through whom." "That's going to take hours." "Then we should start." They worked past 10, past 11, the conference table gradually disappearing, under printouts and cross-reference timelines. Natalie's laptop, humming quietly, beside a growing stack of financial summaries that told, piece by piece, an increasingly disturbing story. Somewhere around 11:30, Clemente ordered food from a place 2 blocks over, and by the time it arrived, cartons of noodles, considerably less impressive than Saturday's 7-course dinner, both of them had abandoned any pretense of formality. Natalie had kicked off her heels an hour earlier, curling her feet beneath her in the chair. Clemente's tie hung loose around his open collar, sleeves rolled higher than usual. The composed executive from that morning gradually giving way to someone more tired, more human, more willing to sit on the floor beside the coffee table, sorting documents by hand because it was, he'd admitted grudgingly, easier than doing it standing up. "This is considerably less glamorous than Saturday," Natalie said, picking at noodles with a plastic fork. Saturday had better lighting. Saturday had a string quartet. Saturday also had Bianca Adornetto questioning the structural integrity of your dress. "Don't remind me." Natalie set down her carton, studying him for a moment in the low light of his desk lamp, the quiet stillness of the office settling around them, in a way that felt entirely different from the noise and performance of the ballroom. "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things all night." "A different kind of thing." She hesitated, then decided the hour was late enough, and the last 2 days strange enough, that honesty had become the only currency worth spending. "Why did you invite me?" "Saturday. To dinner. You could have gone alone, or brought Matteo, or brought literally anyone else in this building who wouldn't have caused an international incident with the seating chart." Clemente was quiet for a moment, turning his own carton slowly between his hands. "I thought it would be amusing," he said finally. Something in Natalie's chest went cold. She'd braced herself for a lot of possible answers to that question, but not that one. Not the confirmation of the exact thing she'd spent 14 months quietly refusing to consider, that the invitation had been, underneath everything, a joke at her expense, a chance to watch the fat secretary flounder outside her natural habitat for everyone's entertainment. "Right," she said, and heard her own voice go carefully neutral in the specific way it did when she was working hard not to let something show. "Well, glad I could provide the evening's entertainment." Clemente looked up sharply, catching something in her tone that made him realize, almost instantly, exactly how badly he'd phrased it. "That's not what I meant." "It's fine, Clemente. It's not fine, and it's not what I meant." He set down his own food, sitting forward now, his full attention on her in a way that made retreating from the conversation considerably harder than she wanted it to be. "I expected you to refuse. That was the joke, if there was one, that I'd offer. Certain you'd tell me exactly what you thought of the idea, and we'd both understand it as the challenge it was. You spend your working life telling me when my ideas are terrible. I assumed you'd tell me this one was terrible too. So the surprise wasn't that I came." "No." His voice had gone quieter now, more careful. "The surprise was watching you belong there. Completely. Better than half the people who'd been attending Lombardo dinners for 20 years. He paused. "You fit into that room better than I do, Natalie. I've spent my entire life being taught how to occupy it. You simply walked in and did it." The words sat between them, warmer than she'd expected, entirely different from what she'd braced herself for. "That might be the strangest compliment anyone's ever given me," she said finally. "I'm told my compliments require translation. You're getting better at the original language." Something eased in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. the particular warmth she was beginning to recognize as uniquely his, rare enough that she'd started keeping a private count. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them narrowing slightly without either one consciously choosing it, the quiet of the office pressing in with a kind of intimacy neither the ballroom nor the boardroom had ever managed to produce. Then Clemente's phone rang, sharp and sudden against the silence, and he glanced at the screen with visible reluctance before answering. Yes. A pause, his expression shifting instantly back into the controlled focus Natalie recognized from Saturday night. When? Another pause, longer this time, and Natalie watched something harden across his face. "We'll be there," he said, and ended the call. "What is it?" "The financial team found something in the Bellendy transaction," he said, already reaching for his jacket. "Something that shouldn't be there. They want us to see it tonight." The financial team's discovery turned out to require another formal event before it could be properly examined. A fundraising gala Clemente had already committed to attending, where the executive who'd flagged the anomaly insisted on delivering the details in person rather than over a line that might not be secure. Natalie found herself, 3 nights later, back in heels and shapewear despite every lesson the red dress should have taught her, standing in a hotel ballroom considerably less grand than the Lombardo estate, but no less exhausting to navigate for 2 hours while pretending the investigation wasn't the only thing on either of their minds. By the second hour, she had reached her limit. She excused herself to the ladies' room, locked herself into a stall, and began the process of extracting herself from the shapewear with the grim determination of a woman diffusing something explosive. It came free eventually, and she stood there for a moment simply breathing, fully, deeply, the way her body had apparently been begging to for the past 2 hours, before folding the offending garment into a small, guilty bundle and stuffing it into the bottom of her gold clutch. Freedom, she thought, returning to the ballroom with considerably more ease in her step, was worth whatever social risk came with slightly less structured silhouette. She found Clemente near the bar, deep in conversation with the financial executive, and slipped in beside him, just as the man finished explaining the discrepancy he'd found buried in the Bellendy transaction records. "I need the flash drive," Clemente said to her, once the executive had excused himself. "You put it in your bag earlier, for safekeeping." "Front pocket," Natalie said, already scanning the room for Viscari, who'd arrived 20 minutes earlier and was currently laughing too loudly at something near the dessert table. Clemente reached into her clutch without looking, his attention still on the room, and pulled out something that was decidedly not a flash drive. He looked down. Natalie looked over. Time, for a moment, did something unkind. Clemente held the beige garment at arm's length with the particular, careful confusion of a man who had spent his entire career examining evidence and had genuinely, for 1 full second, no idea what he was looking at. "Put that back," Natalie said, with as much dignity as the situation permitted, which was very little. "What is it?" "Something you don't have clearance for." I asked a direct question. He turned it slightly, studying the structure with an expression of grave, misplaced seriousness, as though it might be some manner of security device. "It appears to be reinforced." "It is reinforced. Reinforced against several forms of movement, breathing, and dignity. Put it back in the bag, Clemente. You're being remarkably evasive for someone usually so forthcoming. I'm protecting you from information you cannot unknow." "That seems unlikely to work, given that I'm already holding it." Natalie reached over and plucked it from his hand with more force than strictly necessary, shoving it back into her clutch and snapping it shut with the finality of a woman ending a conversation permanently. And then Clemente laughed. Not the near smile she'd catalogued twice now, not the flicker at the corner of his mouth she'd started keeping private count of, an actual laugh, low and startled out of him, entirely unguarded. The sound of a man who had clearly not expected himself to make it, and had no idea what to do with the fact that he had. Natalie forgot, briefly, to be embarrassed. She'd worked for Clemente Lombardo for 14 months. She had seen him amused, seen him satisfied, seen the rare flicker of something warmer crossing his features when a joke landed the way he'd intended it to. She had never once heard him actually laugh. "I've never heard that before," she said, before she could stop herself. The laugh faded, but something warmer remained in its place, something he didn't immediately try to smooth back into his usual composure. "I don't do it often," he admitted. "Clearly, you should. It's disarming. That's precisely why I don't do it often." They stood there for a moment, closer than the conversation strictly required, the noise of the gala receding into something distant and unimportant. Natalie was aware, suddenly, of exactly how close he'd stepped without either of them noticing it happening, of the particular quality of his attention when it settled fully on her rather than scanning the room for threats or opportunities. "I can't remember the last time someone made me laugh like that," Clemente said, quieter now. "That's deeply concerning, and possibly a medical condition." Noted. He didn't move away, and neither did she, and the space between them narrowed the rest of the way without either of them making a conscious decision to close it. When he kissed her, it wasn't sudden or possessive, nothing like the confident, calculated moves she might have expected from a man who negotiated for a living. It was deliberate, careful, preceded by enough of a pause that she understood, with total clarity, that he was giving her every opportunity to step back before it happened. She didn't. His hand came up to rest against her jaw, and Natalie felt something in her chest give way completely, the last of her professional distance, dissolving into something she'd been carefully not naming for 3 days. When they finally broke apart, neither of them reached immediately for words. The ballroom noise slowly filtering back in around them, like the volume had been turned back up after being muted. "This complicates the investigation," Natalie said eventually, breathless in a way that undermined the practicality of the statement. "Considerably. You're my employer. I'm aware. This is likely a terrible idea. Almost certainly." He didn't look remotely concerned about that fact. "I find I no longer care as much as I probably should." Natalie searched his face for the careful, guarded composure she'd spent 14 months learning to read, and found, instead, something entirely undefended. A man who had spent years filing every part of his life into careful categories, looking at her now like she'd become the one thing he had no idea how to file anywhere at all. Across the room, unnoticed by either of them, Matteo watched the entire exchange over the rim of his glass, with an expression of pure, undisguised delight. The week that followed unfolded with a warmth Natalie hadn't let herself expect. Late nights bent over financial records that gradually turned into late nights that included dinner, quiet conversations that started as investigation updates and drifted, without either of them quite deciding to let them, into something more personal. She learned that Clemente quietly paid university tuition for the children of 2 employees who died in the family's service, a fact she discovered by accident in an old expense ledger and which he refused, with visible discomfort, to discuss further. He learned that her mother called every Sunday at exactly 11 without fail, and that Natalie answered every single time no matter what she was doing. It felt, for the first time in 14 months, like something real was being built rather than simply managed, which was why the discovery, when it came, landed so much harder than it otherwise might have. She noticed the car first. The same dark sedan parked outside her apartment 3 mornings in a row, the same one that seemed to trail a discreet half-block behind her on the walk to the subway. She mentioned it to Clemente on Thursday, expecting concern, expecting him to take the observation seriously and investigate. Instead, he looked briefly uncomfortable, which told her everything before he said a word. "I assigned additional security," he admitted. "After the breach, you've had access to sensitive information for over a week, and if whoever compromised my credentials realizes you're the one closing in on them, you could become a target. You had me followed. I had you protected, without telling me. I didn't want to alarm you, I'm a grown woman investigating a security breach for a man who runs a criminal organization. Clemente, I don't alarm easily. What alarms me is discovering that decisions are being made about my life without my knowledge. Natalie's voice had gone very level, the particular quiet she reserved for things that genuinely angered her rather than merely irritated her. You didn't ask. You just did it. I was trying to keep you safe. You keep saying that like it explains everything. Like safety is a reason that automatically justifies taking away my choice in the matter. She crossed her arms, standing very straight, refusing to let this dissolve into the easy warmth their arguments usually carried. I understand the reasoning, Clemente. I don't understand why you didn't think I deserved to hear it from you before I found the car myself. He didn't have a good answer for that, and the silence stretched long enough that Natalie understood, with a sinking feeling, that this conversation was not actually finished, that whatever discomfort he was carrying went deeper than one unmentioned security detail. There's something else, he said finally. Of course there is. You mentioned 2 weeks ago that you'd been approached about a senior operations position, another company. Natalie went very still. How do you know about that? I have contacts. I heard about the recruitment through business channels. That doesn't answer my question. Clemente's jaw worked once, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its usual composure. I used some influence to delay the process. Nothing threatening. A conversation with the hiring committee, suggesting the timeline might benefit from patience given ongoing sensitive matters at my company. The room went very quiet. You interfered with my job offer. I delayed it, temporarily, until the breach investigation concluded, so that you wouldn't be transitioning into a new role during an active security crisis. That wasn't your decision to make. I was protecting the investigation, and you. You were protecting your own convenience, Natalie said, and the words came out sharper than she'd intended. Sharper because they were true, and because saying them out loud made the shape of what he'd done finally completely clear. You didn't want me distracted by a job offer while I was useful to you. So you made a phone call and quietly took away an opportunity I've been working toward for years, and you didn't think I deserved to know that either. That's not, isn't it? Her voice had gone very steady now, the calm, dangerous steadiness that meant she'd moved past anger into something colder. You keep saying you were keeping me safe, keeping the investigation protected, as if those words automatically make it acceptable to make decisions about my career without consulting me. That's not protection, Clemente. That's control. And you don't get to call it something gentler just because you meant well. Clemente stood very still, and for the first time since she'd known him, Natalie watched him search for an argument and failed to find one. I was wrong, he said finally, quietly. About the security. About the recruitment. I should have told you. I should have asked. Yes, you should have. I don't know how to do this without controlling it, he admitted, echoing, unknowingly, something he'd said to her once before, in a different context, in a moment that had felt like intimacy instead of confession. Everything in my life, I manage. I protect the things that matter by controlling the variables around them. I don't know how to want something and simply let it make its own choices. Then you need to learn, Natalie said, because I am not a variable, Clemente. I'm not a document you can file into whatever category keeps you comfortable. I make my own decisions about my career, my safety, and my life. And if you can't manage a relationship without deciding you're entitled to override those decisions whenever it's convenient, then I don't see how this works. She reached into her bag, retrieved her badge, and set it on the desk between them, with a precision that felt, in that moment, like the only thing keeping her composed. I quit. Natalie. Don't. Her voice cracked, just slightly, the first real fracture in her composure since the conversation began. Don't tell me not to. Ask me to stay, if you want to. Actually ask, instead of assuming you already know what's best for me. Clemente opened his mouth and closed it again, and Natalie understood, watching him search for words that didn't arrive, that he had no idea how to ask for anything, without also trying to control the answer. She left without waiting for him to find them. The office continued functioning without her, which was, Clemente discovered, considerably worse than if it had fallen apart entirely. Her replacement was competent, a young woman named Priya who managed the calendar with reasonable efficiency and made no glaring errors in the first 2 weeks, and yet the space outside his office felt unmistakably emptier. Meetings ran according to schedule, with none of the small, necessary reorganizations Natalie used to make without asking. Seating charts, when they came up at all, contained no observations about decade-old grudges. Nobody told him his ideas were terrible, which he discovered, with some discomfort, he missed considerably more than he'd expected to. It wasn't that the office couldn't run without her. It was that it ran without the parts of it that had made coming to work feel like something other than obligation. Matteo noticed, because Matteo noticed everything, and made a point of mentioning it with the particular relentlessness of a man who considered his cousin's misery a personal entertainment. "You look terrible," Matteo said, dropping into the chair across from Clemente's desk one Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Natalie had left. "I'm working. You're staring at a document you haven't turned in 10 minutes. I'm considering it carefully." "You're thinking about Natalie." Clemente didn't answer, which Matteo correctly interpreted as confirmation. "You know," Matteo said, more gently than usual, "for a man who prides himself on strategy, you made an extraordinarily poor decision. You had something rare, Clemente, a woman who told you the truth even when it cost her something, and you responded by taking away her choices, the one thing she'd probably fought her whole life to hold on to. I know what I did. Then fix it." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You're simply afraid of doing it." Clemente had no response for that, mostly because it was true, and Matteo, satisfied that the point had landed, left him alone with the silence he'd apparently decided he deserved. The breach investigation, without Natalie's continued involvement, had stalled. Priya was capable, but she lacked the intuitive understanding of the company's administrative ecosystem that had let Natalie spot inconsistencies invisible to anyone without 14 months of managing every calendar, every document flow, every quiet, informal relationship that kept the machinery running. Clemente's security team combed through logs and access records with methodical thoroughness and found nothing that Natalie's instincts hadn't already pointed toward weeks earlier. It was Natalie, in fact, working independently from her apartment with nothing but the files she'd already reviewed before her departure, who found the final piece. She hadn't intended to keep working the case. She'd told herself, repeatedly, that it was no longer her problem, that she'd handed off everything relevant before she left, that Clemente's very well-funded security apparatus could finish what she'd started without her. But she kept thinking about Gabriel. No, not Gabriel, she reminded herself. This was a different story, a different name, a mid-level executive named Franco who'd been quietly flagged as a possible suspect based on incomplete evidence, and the possibility that an innocent employee might take the fall for something he hadn't done, sat with her uncomfortably enough that she couldn't fully let it go. She pulled up her old notes one final time, cross-referencing the access timestamp from the night of the Lombardo dinner against every executive's personal schedule, and found, buried in a detail she'd missed the first 3 times through, a pattern that made everything click into place. The credentials hadn't been stolen through hacking or technical exploitation. They'd been physically accessed. Someone had used Clemente's own laptop, left unattended in his office during the dinner while his usual security detail assumed he was simply working late, to authorize the document and forward it directly to an external account linked, 3 transactions removed, to Adrian Viscari. Only one person had access to that office during the relevant window, according to the building's own keycard logs. Senior executive Marcus Delacroix, whose long friendship with Viscari Natalie had noted weeks earlier and dismissed as irrelevant social overlap. She sent the evidence to Clemente's security chief directly, without contacting Clemente himself, because the truth mattered more than any point she still had left to make. Clemente received the confirmation within hours. Delacroix's access logs, the financial trail connecting him to Viscari, the fabricated briefing document traced finally to its source. The breach was resolved. The acquisition halted before it could compromise anything further, and the responsible party dealt with in ways Clemente didn't discuss in detail with anyone outside his organization. It should have felt like victory. Instead, staring at the email, confirming Natalie had sent the final piece without being asked, without any obligation remaining between them, Clemente felt something considerably closer to shame. He learned, the same week, through the same business channels that had first told him about her recruitment, that Natalie had received the senior operations offer after all. The delay he'd manufactured finally expired, the position hers if she wanted it. His first instinct was immediate, reflexive. Make a better offer, promote her here, do whatever was necessary to keep her close. He caught himself before he acted on it, recognizing, with the particular clarity that came from having already made this mistake once, that trying to keep her by outbidding her future would simply be the same failure wearing more expensive clothing. Instead, he picked up the phone and called the hiring committee directly. Not to interfere, to do what he should have done months earlier. "I want to give you a professional reference," he said, when the call connected. "For Natalie Strauss. I've had the privilege of working closely with her for over a year, and I can tell you without reservation that she's the sharpest operational mind I've employed. You'd be fortunate to have her." He gave the reference in full, without qualification, without a single word designed to delay or discourage, and hung up feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks, something that resembled the beginning of having done one thing correctly. It wasn't enough. He knew that. Natalie deserved considerably more than a corrected mistake delivered too late. But it was, he understood, a start, and starting, for a man who had spent his entire life controlling every outcome before it arrived, was its own kind of difficult surrender. Natalie found out about the reference 3 days after accepting the position, when the head of the hiring committee mentioned, almost in passing, how glowing Clemente Lombardo's recommendation had been. "He said you were the sharpest operational mind he'd employed," the woman said. "No qualifications, no conditions. I don't think I've ever heard him speak that way about anyone." Natalie sat with that for a long time after the call ended, turning it over the way she used to turn over discrepancies in access logs, looking for the catch, the string attached, the quiet self-interest she'd learned to expect from him. She didn't find one. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He hadn't mentioned it to her at all. That, more than anything, was what finally cracked something open in her chest that she'd spent 3 weeks keeping carefully sealed. Clemente came to her apartment on a Tuesday evening. No security car idling at the curb, no guards stationed at a discreet distance, none of the machinery he usually surrounded himself with. He stood on her doorstep looking, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely uncertain of his welcome. "You didn't have to give the reference," she said, opening the door before he could knock a second time. "Yes, I did. You could have stayed quiet. I would never have known you were the reason the delay happened in the first place, let alone that you tried to fix it. That's precisely why I had to do it." He stood very still in her doorway, hands at his sides, none of the careful command he usually carried into every room. "I decided, once, that because I had the power to protect you, I also had the right to decide what that protection looked like. I was wrong. Giving you the reference wasn't about fixing what I did. It was about finally doing the thing I should have done from the beginning, which was trust you enough to let your own choices stand without my interference." Natalie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, unwilling to make this easy for him, and unable, entirely, to stay unmoved by it either. "You should take the job," Clemente continued. "You've been doing operational work above your title for longer than I've known how to properly value it. I should have promoted you months ago. I didn't, because having you outside my office, dependent on it, suited me. That's an ugly thing to admit, but it's true, and I'd rather you hear it from me than continue believing something gentler. That may be the least romantic confession anyone has ever made to me. I haven't reached the romantic part yet. Something in his voice, careful and slightly unsteady, made her uncross her arms. I have taken the job, she said. Already. Yesterday. Good. He said it plainly, without a trace of the earlier instinct to reclaim her, to make a counteroffer, to fold her back into his orbit through convenience. You'll be extraordinary at it. I know. The corner of his mouth moved, the small, private, almost smile she'd catalogued so carefully over the past several weeks, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. I'd like to take you to dinner, Clemente said finally. Not a Lombardo dinner, not an investigation. No audience, no seating chart, no confidential documents hiding in the appetizers. Just dinner. I've done dinner with you before. It turned into an internal security crisis. A smaller restaurant, this time. Any organized crime at all? I can offer no guarantees, but I'll do my best to keep the criminal activity to a minimum for one evening. Natalie studied him for a long moment, the careful hope in his expression, entirely undefended, nothing left to file her behind, and nothing left, she understood now, that he wanted to. Fine, she said. One dinner, no employment attached. None. If you try to schedule my future without asking again, I will end you professionally and possibly in other ways I haven't fully worked out yet. Understood. She smiled, finally, and stepped back to let him in. Several months later, Natalie stood in the entrance of the Lombardo estate once more, wearing something midnight blue this time, chosen because she loved it, rather than because it made a point. No shapewear beneath it, because she had decided, somewhere in the intervening months, that civilization asked quite enough of her already. Clemente offered his arm as they crossed the threshold, and she took it easily, without the careful formality of that first night, without the particular vertigo of not knowing where she stood. Matteo spotted them from across the room and grinned, the same delighted grin he'd worn since the beginning of all of it. I still can't believe inviting her was supposed to be a joke, he said, ambling over with a glass already in hand. Clemente's expression went appropriately murderous. Natalie patted his arm, unbothered. No, Matteo, it was definitely a joke. Clemente looked down at her. She smiled up at him, warm and entirely unashamed. He just got the punchline wrong. Clemente bent close enough that only she could hear him, his voice low against her ear. I've been paying for it ever since. Good, she said. Keep paying. He laughed. The real one, low and unguarded. The one she'd once thought so rare and now heard, gratefully, often, and together, they walked into the room. No categories left between them. Nowhere else either of them needed to be filed. Natalie never needed rescuing. She never needed a makeover, a miracle dress, or anyone's permission to belong in that room. She needed one thing, a man arrogant enough to invite her as a joke, and humble enough to eventually admit he got the punchline wrong. So tell me, in the comments, was there a moment you knew Clemente had already lost the joke? Was it the doorway, the laugh over the Spanx, or the reference call he made asking for nothing in return? And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who later had to watch you thrive anyway, drop "Watch Me" below. You already know exactly how good that feeling is. Hit subscribe if you want more of this world, because somewhere out there, Vescari's associates haven't forgotten who cost them the Belandi deal, and Matteo has already started planning next year's seating chart like it's a competitive sport. Natalie got the last word this time. Something tells me she's going to keep getting it.